Welcome to The Exchange. I'm Dan Riley. The Exchange is a streaming internet talk show and podcast of interviews with noteworthy people about their lives, ideas, and current events. This week I sit down with Jennifer Friedenbach, Executive Director of the Coalition on Homelessness. During our conversation, Jennifer talks about the history of homelessness in America, a few of its main causes and common myths, and potential federal public policies that would dramatically reduce its frequency. Welcome to the show. I'm sitting down with Jennifer Friedenbach, who's the Executive Director of the Coalition on Homelessness in San Francisco. Jennifer, welcome to the show, and thanks for taking some time to talk about homelessness and talk about what you guys do here.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. I'd love to start by learning a little bit about what got you interested in the subject of homelessness initially. Why was this something that you personally wanted to get involved with?
Well, I actually kind of fell into it, and I applied for a position driving a truck in San Mateo County for the food bank there, and they ended up hiring me as a secretary and part-time with the Hunger and Homeless Action Coalition of San Mateo County. And I worked with some pretty amazing people, and I always knew I wanted to do something in nonprofit, something social justice related, and what I quickly came to realize is that homelessness is where all these different oppressions intersect, and where there's still a whole lot of hatred out there against the population, where it's a way to mask racism and other societal problems. And so I kind of got hooked, and I've, been continuing ever since, because I haven't really felt that full, complete sense of completion yet. Mm-hmm.
Are we, at this point in the U.S. history, is it as bad as it's ever been? Is it worse than it was 50 years ago? How do you see the U.S. generally dealing with these topics?
Well, we certainly have the highest numbers of people experiencing homelessness since the Great Depression. But the big onslaught of the crises happened in the early 80s, and it has, grown steadily ever since. Where we've made, instead of going back and trying to correct those structural issues that caused the crises in the early 80s, we've made a series of bad policy decisions that have resulted in greater numbers of people experiencing homelessness. And while we've done a little bit to get homeless people off the streets, we've done so much more worse to create more homelessness. So we're definitely in a bad place right now, especially in particular populations. Family homelessness in particular is at its worst, and it's been the highest in 3 decades, but certainly the highest since the Great Depression.
Take me back to the early 80s. What was it that happened in that time period that led to the explosion or the increase in homelessness in the U.S.?
Well, starting in the late 70s, but really getting rolling in the early 80s in a major way, we cut our federal housing budget by 74%. And it reached, the funding just basically plunged down to its lowest point in 1983 when we started opening up shelters across the country. And that timing of that, what Reagan at that time would have said, we're getting ourselves out of the housing business. But it was deconstructing a lot of the things that were put in place in the New Deal in this country. We had cut everybody off of disability. We ended up with our economy switching over to more of a service sector economy, lower wages, no benefits. We had a situation where our wages got really flat and they weren't keeping up with the rising cost of rents. And that certainly, we have so much income disparity and a huge disparity between rent and income now, fast forwarding to 2014. It's even worse. But those were all the things that were happening. Public assistance cuts, huge cuts to mental health treatment. Our entire system basically just got snipped and snipped and snipped. And the biggest one, the very single biggest one, was that massive reduction in housing.
Is there any movement now or any interest in the public at large or in the political system to increase the funding that's allocated for those resources?
It's kind of an interesting thing, because you look at San Francisco, you look at any big city mayor's programs or what big cities are facing, and homelessness is almost always the top issue. It's certainly been the top issue in San Francisco, for the last for mayoral reigns. And here, and in other cities, it's much the same, but it has not translated to the federal government. They've really washed their hands of the problem. They rarely even talk about poverty, frankly. They talk about, we had this huge issue with the recession and all the foreclosures, and it was very much framed in a middle class kind of terms. And it's almost like, talking about homelessness or poverty is a no-go area, and they don't go and don't talk about it. And so, at the same time, there's a tremendous amount of public pressure to address the issue, both in a negative and in a positive way. And so it's this interesting schism that needs to be closed.
You mentioned that it's a topic that politicians often don't even address. Why is that?
There's a number of things, but, at this point, part of what's happened over time is that the homeless population has been completely vilified. And, we've managed to, at least we've attempted to create this permanent underclass. And the way that's worked is that you had the federal government making all these really bad policy decisions that led to these huge crises in the local communities. The local communities didn't really have a means to address it. And so they're left with doing a couple of things, and one of which is calling in the police and having the police manage the population. They can use the criminal justice system as a way to address it, which is virtually what we've done in all the major cities in the U.S., where, homeless people are being jailed for being poor. And the only way you get away with that is this shift in public opinion. And the only way that politicians have figured out how to manage this problem is really to start these public campaigns, these public education campaigns where they're turning the public against homeless people. And there have been very protracted campaigns around moving public opinion from, this is a structural problem, whether it was, Reagan's closing of institutions is kind of the common one, or, whether people have a deeper analysis than that, to it's the person's fault who's been homeless. Either there's something wrong with them or they've done something wrong, and that's why they're homeless. And so in San Francisco, you've seen it over and over again. You constantly see public officials talking about how people are turning down services, how they're coming in from out of town, how they're basically choosing to be homeless, and just really perpetuating these myths that aren't backed up by data at all. Mm-hmm. And what that does is it lets our local politicians off the hook. Or, alternatively, demonizing homeless people, as was done in, when Newsom was running for mayor here, a lot of demonization stuff. We got to cut public assistance because they're going to spend it all on drugs and alcohol. We need to make it, aggressive panhandling and do 6 months in jail because they're all spending it on drugs and alcohol. So they even put up billboards that said homeless people spread venereal disease. As a way to try to pass aggressive panhandling measures. So there's been just constantly these really, really nasty campaigns that have been successful, and people have shifted their attitudes. They now, often, the biggest misnomer is that people think homeless folks in San Francisco are not San Franciscans. They think they came from elsewhere, even though the data doesn't show that. But people are shocked. It's like, no, the majority of homeless people in San Francisco became homeless as San Franciscans. Or another myth is that people are, that homeless by choice is an urban myth. That's another one that's been really, that's really kind of set into the consciousness. So, it lets our policymakers off the hook when someone's doing it. And in reality, it's of course not the case at all. No one chooses to be homeless. That's a crazy idea. You're going to die much quicker. It's really miserable. You're, sleeping on concrete. Human beings aren't meant to live outdoors. Your health deteriorates. You're traumatized day after day. You're treated like crap by everybody involved. It's, it's very, very difficult. So, those are the kind of myths, though, that we're up against when we're trying to address the issue.
And, for most people that come to a big city like this and they see the end result is someone ending up on the street homeless, what are the common stories of people and some of the common themes of who these people had been, things that happened to them in their life that led to the point where you see them walking around with, all of their possessions in a grocery cart? Yeah,
the most common thing that everyone has in common is lack of access to accumulated wealth, right? So that's when there's a bump in the road, there's nothing really to fall back on. Mm-hmm. And so, if you're impoverished and your family's impoverished and they're already living overcrowded, it's really difficult to live with them. They're not able to take you in. Whereas if you have access to accumulated wealth, something happens and you can, you have some money you can, get from family members or whatever, or if you, or there's plenty of space for you to stay with them or what have you. So I think that's kind of the most common thing is that folks are poor. Mm-hmm. And the most, the biggest difference between poor people who are housed and poor people who are not housed is whether or not they have a housing subsidy. Mm-hmm. In San Francisco we have rent control, so that would be another factor. Maybe you have access to you're in a rent control unit that you've been there a long time and the rent's relatively low. But aside from that, it's a pretty diverse population, as diverse as America's poor population is, and there's a lot of the oppressions that we see in broad society are reflected in the homeless population. So you have a disproportionate number of African Americans, you have a disproportionate number of people with disabilities, you have a disproportionate number of single moms, all of that. And so, as people, and there's no difference between the populations in terms of increased mental health issues or increased addictive disorders, but at the time of becoming homeless. But of course, when people are homeless for prolonged periods of time, multiple years, it's incredibly traumatizing. Their health starts deteriorating. Their mental health is deteriorating. Their likelihood of developing addictive disorders to self-medicate those issues is much higher. Mm-hmm. And so people get, as they're on the streets longer and longer, they get sicker and sicker. And of course, it would have just been cheaper for us to house them to begin with. It actually costs more money to keep people homeless than it does to put them in housing. Mm-hmm. And at the very best, at the very worst, we're breaking even. So it's a really bad policy decision that we're making, keeping folks homeless.
Have there been any major policy decisions or options or votes that have taken place in the last 10 years that really were, at least had a legitimate chance at taking a serious whack at the homelessness problem in America? Or have those potential forms of legislation just not even been in existence at all?
There has been some housing initiatives that have not made it very far on the federal level, and there's been, kind of like some hate crime stuff that hasn't made it very far on the federal level. There's been a lot of local initiatives that have been successful, and then a lot more that haven't been. So it's pretty varied. But the federal government, really what needs to happen, and this is where it's pretty challenging with the lack of interest at the federal level, is they need to restore funding for housing in this country. They don't have to necessarily do it the same way they did it to begin with, but they certainly need to do construction. Mm-hmm. And maybe they don't need to do, huge public housing developments that are 100% extremely low income. You can do mixed developments. You can, put in commercial spaces. You can place them in areas where you have economic development, where you have banks, where you have grocery stores. I certainly could do it in the country. And probably, 30 days of Iraq war spending, we could have constructed enough housing for every man, woman, and child in the United States, and it would have been beautiful housing. And so it's just a matter of political will. And so there's been those initiatives, and there is every year initiatives to try to comprehensively fund housing in one way or another. There's been the National Housing Trust Fund movement for quite a while, and instead we're going in the opposite direction. Every year we've been cutting. There's this whole agenda to cut public housing so severely that we just totally get out of the business of public housing, so that the public housing developments become so decrepit and so unlivable that we have to come in and say, oh, we need to tear this housing out, which is what what happened famously in New Orleans. And so that's the direction we're going in. It's a complete opposite direction. And as we continue in that direction, we're creating more and more homelessness. And it's a huge mistake.
You were mentioning earlier about some of the mental health and addictive issues that are afflicted by people who are homeless. And perhaps one of the misnomers is that those are actually develop after they become homeless. It's not necessarily the addiction or the mental illness that's causing the homelessness. It's often the other way around. Is that the case? Is that your experience?
My point is that at the point of homelessness, in low-income communities, there's no higher proportion of between if you're housed or not housed, there's no higher percentages of mental illness or substance abuse between the two populations. It's pretty much the same. The rates start increasing as people are homeless for a long period of time. Mm-hmm. So absolutely homelessness causes mental health issues, and absolutely it causes addictive disorders, if you look at it from that perspective. And it's really the trauma involved that is that link. Mm-hmm. And so addictive disorders and mental health issues are very, a lot of times linked to trauma. You look at women, for example, with addictive disorders, and very high percentages of them have some kind of physical or sexual trauma in their past. And so it's really, really hard for women to stay safe out on the streets, for example. The likelihood of experiencing a sexual assault is really high. You don't have a door to lock. You're totally open prey out there. So you think about these experiences that people have and then that link to sexual trauma, to addictive disorders, and then not being able to access treatment because, of course, our treatment programs have been cut to death, and not ever having that safety. It's really, really difficult. Mm-hmm. So, that's just one kind of example, but it's definitely a problem being homeless. It's really, really hard to stay healthy.
Are there countries that have programs or have a certain amount of money that's allocated for homeless people that you would view as a potential model that could be implemented in the U.S., or at least something that we could aspire to?
Yeah, pretty much every Western country has, besides the United States. None of them have the level of homelessness that we see. There's some, Australia has, a little bit, and there's, England has a little bit, there's nothing looking at like what we're looking at. In San Francisco, we have 2,100 homeless children alone, and that's just school age. So nobody's looking at the numbers that we're looking at in the United States. And we're just one city, in a country. So our rates are high. If for those countries, they have housing allowances, they have guaranteed unemployment. They don't have a whole bunch of different public assistance programs. You just if you're out of work, you get employment, and you have housing, mm-hmm. and that's how they do it. And so, as some of them have started, like England, for example, and Australia have started following the United States in kind of having a much more conservative attitude towards social programs, and have started cutting away at their own social safety nets. They've seen increases in homelessness, and have started to kind of go down our road, not as severely and as poorly as we have gone, but that's certainly happening. And so it's really not rocket science. Mm-hmm. You have other countries also have much higher minimum incomes instead of having these huge disparities between rents and incomes, and so they've been much farther ahead in that way too. The countries that, and a lot of the countries that have the strongest social programs and the strongest safety network are the same ones that are thriving economically, that are the strongest from that perspective. You look at Germany. They've got a very, very strong economy in Germany, and they've also they don't have homelessness there. Mm-hmm. They've got, they do have some squatting that happens for sure. But they have a lot more protection for squatters' rights there. But you're not going to see people on the streets when you're in Germany at all. And they do have access to housing and income, and definitely some economic development that's more targeted towards folks.
Is it something about America? Is it something about the story that Americans tell themselves that's at the core of the problem? Is it part of our ideology? What is it that makes the problem so much worse here than everywhere else?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and absolutely our culture is a bootstraps culture, right? So it's a sense that everyone can come here and they can do well, and this is the land of opportunity, and if you don't make it, it's because you're not trying hard enough, and you're lazy, and that's why you're not successful. And that is the underlying cultural phenomenon, at least the dominant culture in the United States. And we also measure stuff so heavily by our physical possessions. Mm-hmm. So we don't emphasize community. We don't emphasize collective, support for each other. That's part of our family structure as well. You're expected to make it on your own when you're 18. Of course, that's totally unrealistic at this point. There's just not the jobs or anything for folks, even if they're college educated coming out of college. Like they're gonna need some support in order to make it, and except in very rare circumstances. That's the thing that we tell ourselves. And, at the same time, people in the U.S. like to be very charitable, and they like to give money to poor people. And we also have, this whole charitable institution, which is, which in a lot of ways kind of lets government off the hook. It's super important to do. But there's also this mentality that, the churches can take care of it, or the charities, and we don't have that. We really don't have that political analysis that connects poverty to bad political decisions. We connect it to personal behavior, and that's very, very entrenched in our culture. And that's probably not the case in really anywhere else in the world, whether it's a developing country or a westernized country. I mean, people have that sense of recognizing, we recognize that an environment in the United States, we recognize that a lack of regulation leads to environmental mishaps or environmental destruction, and people make that connection. They never make it in poverty. And I think that is really closely tied to our cultural beliefs.
In a city like this, talk a little bit about what resources are actually at one's disposal if someone is on the cusp of becoming homeless, or actually is homeless and needs help.
So, if someone's on the edge of becoming homeless, meaning maybe dad broke his arm and he does pick up construction work, and that's the steady family income, and he's out of work for a while but doesn't have benefits to carry him over. There is some programs for back rent to try to keep people in their housing. Once you're out of housing, if it's a family with kids, you can expect about a 6-month wait for shelter. You have to go through a pretty extensive assessment process. If you're a single adult, you have to get fingerprinted and biometric imaged and go through all this crazy stuff. And then you can sign up for shelter, and you'll be put on a wait list, and it's about 700 and some odd people long. And then in both of those situations, the shelters will be pretty short term, and then you have to go through that process over again. You can expect there's not going to be a lot of housing resources out there. If you try to get public housing, you'll find the wait list closed. It's if you're lucky enough to be in a shelter and severe enough that you'll get picked for the one housing unit a year that shelter is able to get people into. 1 or 2 or 3 units a year, then you can get lucky, but the chances are you'll be one of the other 1,000 some odd people that are unlucky. So it's not there's not a lot of resources. There's some hot meal programs. You can pretty much expect to eat at least once a day, so you won't starve to death, but you will certainly experience hunger. And so it's I don't think that we're so significantly different from other places. In some of the more cold weather areas of the country during winter time, they're going to have much broader access to shelter, but it's going to be on a night by night basis, and you're going to have to carry your belongings with you, and it's not going to be very stable, and it's probably just going to be during the cold weather spells. But it's not. In San Francisco, for example, we have one shelter for every 5 homeless people.
You work on the ground floor of one of the most challenging social problems that we have as a city and as a country. Where does your hope come from? I mean, how do you come to work every day watching this? And I'm assuming with all of the challenges that you see and all the depravity and all the suffering, that eventually gets channeled into anger oftentimes. And to whom do you direct the anger, or to what do you direct the anger?
So, for us, we at the Coalition on Homelessness, we've had a lot of success. And even though we're sometimes it feels like you're swimming upriver a lot of times, because... Does
it ever feel like you're not swimming upriver?
We make these huge gains. So like last year, we were able to stave off displacement through our efforts for about a couple thousand different households in San Francisco. So, wow, that was incredible. We have all this mass displacement still occurring, but it would have been so much worse. We're able to get, through our efforts, get hundreds of people, out of homelessness every year. At this point, city has about 6,000 units for homeless people, and a lot of that's due to efforts by us and other community-based organizations really pushing to make it happen, and then doing the hard work to actually construct it. And yet we still have, 6,000 plus people that are still on the streets. And so, in terms of how we channel our anger, how we, channel our efforts, we really try to focus on the policymakers that are either not making any decisions and are just sitting on this issue, or are doing really bad things, and really try to target there, which is where the problem, where the buck starts, and who created the problem to start with. And we really work hard, and this is where you get more inspired and you see kind of just perseverance of human spirit, is homeless people themselves. Our 70% of our staff is homeless or formerly homeless, and all of our campaigns and everything we're working for is all led by and created by homeless people themselves, and coming up with really specific solutions to the problems that they're facing. And that's a really beautiful thing to watch as well.
It does sound like from this conversation that a lot of these issues, in your judgment, it's simply a matter of priorities and money. That this is just a resources question, and if resources and priorities were realigned, that a lot of these major problems are fixable. Is that your view? Absolutely, it's our view. Yeah, it absolutely is. I mean, of course, if we're talking about mental health, if we're talking about substance abuse, those on an individual basis can be really difficult. Mental health, for example, you can try medications, but they're only going to work for 60% of the population. There's going to be 40% of people who have severe psychiatric illnesses that never respond to medication. So, but really fundamentally, what we're talking about right now is we're talking about homelessness. So in terms of getting people in homes, it's not that complicated. We just need the homes. And there's, even in a city as dense as San Francisco, there's plenty of places, if we had the resources, to make it happen. And then you give people keys, nobody's turning that down. Yeah. Everybody wants a safe and decent place to live. And so, it really does in the end up being a resource issue. For the more complicated social issues, the unemployment, these kinds of things, once people are in housing and they're stabilized, it's so much easier to address all that other stuff, can really melt away. And that's a beautiful part of it, And so it's really severe health problems, of course, those are created by living outside, that once you have access to a shower, once you have access to a sink to wash your hands, once you have, all of that it's able to address. And you see it, you see it in the faces of people, it's like human face is that map. You can look at people and see how they're faring or not faring. And, when we see people that are housed and we see them just like a month later, and how much physically better they look, and getting some rest. And, we're talking about people who look 20 years older than their actual age, right? They're suddenly looking the age that they actually are. And, right. It's beautiful to see. The last question I want to ask you, if you could be the benevolent dictator for a day and design and have full control over 2 or 3 or 4 laws, or maybe even one law that could be passed in this country to resolve this issue, or at least really improve the situation, what would you do?
I think the first thing would be the right to housing, and make and just shift around all the resources and make sure that we were moving towards. Of course, a lot of it is new construction, so it wouldn't happen overnight, but within a couple of years we'd be able to house everyone. And it's not an intractable social problem. It's perceived that way, but it's not at all. We're choosing not to solve it.
One other follow-up question I wanted to ask you to that point, because it does seem like the major opposition to these sort of movements, it's an economic argument that generally conservative politicians make against investing money in doing it. And it sounds like if you really crunch the numbers, that oftentimes it's the long-term wrong economic decision to not make that investment up front to provide people with basic rights and basic housing rights and basic sanitation to prevent future hospital bills and whatever else might happen. Is that becoming more of the argument that your organization and other organizations like yours are making, and is it successful?
It really should. Homelessness should not be a partisan issue, exactly for that reason, because we are, wasting resources. And I think I have noticed locally, and I've seen nationally, there have been shifts in people with more conservative ideologies around this issue and kind of coming to the realization that it is sucking up more government resources, keeping people homeless, and it is smarter to address these things. And I think that, we haven't gotten all the way there, but, under the Bush administration, that's when they started talking about, having direct access to housing, that not having to go through a bunch of services in order to get housing. And although they didn't put the resources there that they should have, and kind of just spread a few breadcrumbs around, the thinking on it was correct, at least. That, what's the solution to homelessness? Housing, duh, and figuring that out. So I think that it certainly is the primary part of the messaging, and hopefully, it'll start catching on to stronger and stronger degrees, and we'll start seeing some real fundamental shifts. But, it has to go beyond the rhetoric. They have to actually, our policymakers actually have to put resources towards it, which sometimes that means, and this is where, it ends up being more problematic, but, maybe they need to shift some of the money that they're giving away to other people. A lot of times people talk about, for example, the homeowner exemption in our taxes, and that was sort of what the shift that happened in the early 80s is we started cutting, we cut all the support for federal housing and started giving, a lot more tax breaks, which is basically giving money away to homeowners. And we just, and there's a bunch of those examples, but, so it's got to move beyond the rhetoric. It's got to be actual, priority in terms of where we put our resources.
Jennifer, thanks so much for taking the time and coming on the show.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening. If you're interested in learning more about The Exchange, want to listen to episodes online, or would like to reach out to the show, feel free to visit the show's website at theexchangeshow.com.